Students, this is the next video in a series essentially on how to create data from scratch. If you recall, we're kind of in a set right now where before we dive too deeply into anything around geoprocessing, what we're really trying to focus on here are things around how we take data in any form, whether it already exists, right, downloading it as it is, or whether it exists only in a table, and getting it so that it has some kind of spatial form. And what we were introduced last video was how you can kind of create data from scratch, right? So you can build your own shapes, build your own points, build your own lines, and populate it with attribute data. And as I had introduced last video, we can simplify this to three really big steps, right? The first step is that something needs to know where it is in the world. And so the last video we did a little background into coordinate systems so that we can understand concepts that we're going to introduce, particularly around projected coordinate systems. And this video is actually going to be about how we do the other two steps, how you actually create the spatial data and how you create the attributes that go along with it. So if you're following along, if that's how you're going to do this, you can drag in, from the class projections. Notice my videos, it says September 10th. It's because I haven't updated it. The actual name will reflect the actual date when you have this in your homework folder. But I drug in the Philadelphia correct. We're in the correct place. We're where we're supposed to be. Right, as we talked about in earlier videos, if you're never not sure that you're where you're supposed to be, you can call in a base map from ArcGIS. If you ever feel like just looking at our wonderful Y-shaped city isn't enough to convince you that you're actually inhabiting the world, bringing in a base map is just a good way to remind you, yes, here we are. We're in Philadelphia, right? There's Narberth, there's Jersey, so on and so forth. So in order to start creating a new shape, whenever you're building anything new, there's multiple ways to go about it in ArcGIS. One of the kind of, I would say, foundational concepts that I'll leave you with is that there's multiple pathways to any outcome in ArcGIS. I'll talk about a couple of them every time, but I often teach the one that works best with my muscle memory. And so when creating new files, I often think it's easiest to go directly into ArcCatalog and to right-click the area that you want to create something in. Remember I said before, right-click is a great way to explore anything. And at first breath it doesn't appear like the right-click of a folder did anything too much. We can copy, we can paste, we can delete, we can rename, so on. Aha, but here under New, suddenly we have a whole host of things. If you remember, this is how we built an address locator recently. And right now we're going to use it to actually make our own shapefile. Right? So a shapefile, that is the geometric core of ArcGIS. That's what allows us to create our points, lines, and polygons. And I'm going to walk through how we do it now. Right, so we're creating a shapefile. Feature class be another name for it, but a feature class can also exist in a geodatabase, which is something we'll do for another lesson. When you're beginning, there's three things that it's going to want to know, right? It's going to need to know our name. So I'll just call it our poly, right? Because we're making a polygon. Wants to know what type it's going to be. For now, only really concern yourself with point, polyline, and polygon, right? Pretty easy. Points, just XY coordinates. Polyline, connections between those points. Polygons, using a series of points and then connecting back to the original point. Right, then the final thing it's going to need to know the spatial reference, right? Where am I in the world? What's defining my coordinate system? And when you go to edit, you're now just beginning, and coordinate systems are still going to be relatively new to you. So this is one of the areas where it's easy to get tripped up. Those who want to use the muscle memory, remember we're almost always going to be working in the state plane coordinate system. It is so rare that you will ever create a shape, right, that is not using some projected system. Unless you start to work internationally, in which case you're going to need to learn whatever the projected coordinate system is of that area in which you're working. If you're in the United States, you're going to either be working in the state plane or the UTM, Universal Transverse Mercator. That actually would be pretty good for the world-based system too. But now that you're in the States, you're going to use the state plane. Right, and as I showed previously, if you remember, we had a PowerPoint presentation open, and you can really see the zones and the numbers, right? So this is one way. You could go online and look at a map or a guide that says state plane coordinate system, find the state that you're in and the part of the state that you inhabit, or you want to map, and you can see that's its code name, right? 0502, or in Pennsylvania 3702, and you could use that as a system. Right, so let's look at that, for example. If we know that we're going to want to draw on top of Philadelphia here, we want to be in the area where Philadelphia occupies. All right, so first thing you'll go to is either NAD 1983 or the 2011 update. Either would work, but we want to be projected in feet. That's kind of interesting. You can see the cool thing I have on my computer called Flux. It helps me with my eyesight if I have to work late, so don't be caught off guard that my screen suddenly started getting a little bit pink. Right? If it becomes distracting, I'll switch it back. But when we're picking our coordinate system, right, I know that I'm in Pennsylvania, right? I know that this is my one, but if you remember 3702, right, if we go back to that map, oh my gosh, 3702, there it is where Pennsylvania would be, or sorry, where Philadelphia would be. All right, so it needs a name, needs to know its shape, and needs to know its coordinate system. And there you have it. You've created kind of the bones of something. All right, so right now all something is going to get is its FID and what its shape type is. But as we learned in earlier videos, if you want to add a field, you can engage here and go down to add a field. All right, so remember we explored a number of different options. It could be an integer. Right, it could be a float, which means that it has a decimal. It could be a text. Or we'll just name something that's text and say, you're going to be name. And we'll create something else that says, number. And the reason I'm creating the fields now is you'll learn once you start editing, you can't actually add fields while you're editing. And so you cannot add or delete fields while editing. So it's just something to keep in mind as you're moving forward. So in order to edit, there's any number of ways to get there. You could bring open your editor toolbar and go straight from here. You can go up in your toolbox, find the editing toolbox and engage it here. My muscle memory of choice is to right click what I want to edit and go down to edit. But again, you are in charge of your own muscle memory here. Editor toolbar comes up. Let's explore it for a moment before we go forward. All right, this allows us to click on things if we'd want to edit it. In fact, actually, now that I'm looking at each of these things, I'm going to want to do one thing first before we even start using them. And the most important thing you want to do while you're editing is go over here to create features, right? Because that tells you what you actually have the ability to edit. And what we have the ability to edit and what we want to here is our polygon. So suddenly I click on our polygon and you notice that these came up. This is the simplest of the editing tools. It simply allows you to use straight line segments to draw your vertices, right? So let's just start clicking on some random stuff. And again, I'm drawing a crazy shape in the middle of nowhere here. Double click it and you finish it. Very simple. All right, so let's do some other stuff here. All right, let's say I needed something to stay parallel to Philadelphia. I could start writing, and once you get to something, that's kind of cool, right? You can snap on to a vertice or an edge. But you can also, through right click, right, get any number of options. Well, that's interesting. What if I wanted to just do like a direction, right? So maybe I say in my compass direction I want to do 180 degrees, right? So I can go as long as I want, but I can only move in the direction of 180 degrees in either direction. That's kind of neat. And so I'm going forward. I could right click that and maybe I could do kind of deflection, right? So what angle do I want to deflect myself off? I want to deflect off of 90, right? So that's cool. And keep clicking, I can do length, right? That's interesting. It's going to be in whatever units in which you're projected. We're projected in feet, 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 feet. So that means the unit of measurement here would be feet. So maybe I want it to just be like 10,000 feet, There you go, and it can only be 10,000 feet, and it'll go right there. Or you can do the same thing. You can do direction and length. You could find an absolute XY coordinate that you'd need to do. I mean, there's any number of little things that are worth exploring for you here. Another interesting one is that you have a line you want to keep going with. I could right-click the line and say you should be parallel to that line. Right, and notice, ooh, dear, there we go. That's the only hazards of using the Apple mouse sometimes. All right, so I am moving parallel to this line. I could click that same line and say, oops, edit undo vertice if you don't want to do anything. All right, I could right click that line and I could want to go perpendicular to it. And there you go, I'd be going perpendicular now to that line. Cool. Again, when you're finished, you can double click. Other cool ways to experiment with drawing, right? We're right now drawing a polygon, but you could actually just draw rectangle shapes, right? So you draw one and it keeps it in the shape of a rectangle. You could draw circle shapes, right? Draw circle shapes. And notice the whole time I'm doing this, if I open the attribute table, I'm actually creating shapes. They're getting an FID, and I'm in control of their attributes too, right? You're going to be cheese, and you're going to be pizza, and you're going to be donkey. Right? Because when I type nonsense words, what I actually mean is you can put whatever you want in here, right? State. And I can enter any number that I want here, right? So on and so forth. You're editing the attributes simultaneously when you're editing the shapes. Now we're right now in a sense of, we're in like a sense of stasis here. Well, not necessarily stasis, almost more like we're in an interim state is what I mean to say. And if my computer were to crash right now, I would lose all these shapes. And that's one of the things about engaging the editor toolbar here, because you'll notice something here very critical. Well, two really. Stop and save. Stop simply quits. It gives you the option to save, but it quits. But hitting save saves this shape. So now even if ArcGIS crashes, these shapes will still exist. It's very, very important that you keep doing this on a regular basis. I mean, I cannot say again how critical it is. Right, so let's keep modeling our shapes here. And again, right, you can click to edges. This is a very, very sensitive mouse. I got to be careful here. And all kinds of things that you're able to do. If you start exploring a little bit more, you can see with that shape, you can start to make arcs. Right, that's kind of neat. This gives you whole other options of ways you can draw shapes. We don't even need to get into it. It's totally up to you as a person to explore the various kinds of geometric shapes you can draw. But as we keep moving forward, it's important to focus on some of these, right? So the first one is the vertice, right? So if there's vertices I don't like, I can go to my vertice toolkit here, and then I can start to extend them, right? I can add vertices. You know, if I want to extend out at another point, I can add one here. I can delete one here. And it gives you the ability to play with your vertices here. You know, reshape feature, right? I could, oops, got to engage something. I can engage this, and I could reshape the feature here, right? I'm going to just draw a little extension, and then that becomes part of it, right? So it's allowing you to really extend part of the feature and reshape it. And then one of my favorites here, you know, you can actually cut them, right? So if I wanted to turn this into two, draw a line through it, and suddenly I have two different shapes. Or you can also just engage shapes and start to move them regularly. Again, the world is your canvas and nothing saves until you go under to edit and you save it. Also have the ability to rotate should you choose. So any number of ways that you can model and you know, start to draw your shapes and play with the attributes. I'm going to leave it to you really to explore these a little more in your homework as you start to do it. But the last one that I think is kind of important to do is something that's called clip. So let me give you an example. Oftentimes you're going to be drawing shapes, and you're going to be drawing them in such a way where you want the edges to be precise, right? So you're coming like pretending to be the Delaware River here, and you want it to be precise. And what I'm saying here is instead of trying to be super precise and follow every single vertex, even though, you know, if you zoom in, you're going to see part of the things are off. Look at my first example here, where I just drew it all over the place. And something that's interesting, let me just move all these out of the way, right, because they're going to get in trouble too if I don't. Oops. but I will leave the circle just to prove my point. If I hold on to this thing, right, so I'm selecting another object, and I go to clip, and I can either preserve what's underneath it or discard it, right? So you can imagine what the difference is between the two. So I discard. Everything that this overlaps disappears. So suddenly you do have that exact, precise fit right along the edge. So clip's a very important tool to keep in mind because it allows you to have those precise edges. Oops, didn't mean to be doing that. Sorry about that. Again, once you're finished, you can save, you can head to stop, and you now have your file. I will leave it to you in your homeworks to play around a little bit more, but those are the basic things to keep in mind: how you draw, how you clip, how you're able to edit your vertices. That's what allows you to create the shapes that you need to create.